This is Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer, a podcast where Tim and his friends engage in purposeful conversation about identity, parenting, culture, faith, and more. Tim Stauffer is a professor of counseling and a licensed clinical counselor. My name is Sam Meyung, and I'm Tim's friend. My life has been greatly enriched by my time talking to Tim and getting his thoughts on many matters that impact my life daily. After listening to this podcast, I hope you feel the same. Guideposts are discernment markers. They provide opportunities for direction as well as warnings of pitfalls. Go this way and be careful of that way. We hope that each episode provides some sense of direction as we navigate the challenges of daily life. Thanks so much for listening. A quick disclaimer, the content of this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your licensed mental health provider. Tim, so today we're going to talk about attachment theory, which I know very little about, practically next to nothing. And so I'm excited to talk about this with you. And because of the little bit that you have shared with me, I can tell has a lot of implications. And so I'm excited to talk about that with you today.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area of study and certainly impacts all of us. We all have an attachment style. And so one aspect was part of my work in attachment theory was related to my dissertation. When I was looking at sexual addictions, one of my variables was attachment styles. And so I was looking at how a person attaches to a spouse or the way they're wired or developed to bond with other people. Does that play a role in sexual addictions, which clearly the literature and my research confirmed is yes, it does. Attachment styles are a big deal.
So what is that? What is attachment theory? I think I kind of heard like a little definition in what you were just saying, but how would you define what that is?
So attachment theory really grew out of John Bowlby's work and Dr. Ainsworth's work, and watching children and how children bonded to their parents or to their primary caregiver. And as they watched children, they began to develop the theory. And from it, 4 primary categories have emerged that we now call adult attachment styles. But as children, they began to observe it. You can think about it as if you drop your kids off at the nursery and watch the way different children respond when their parents drop them at the nursery, at church, or at daycare. Those children that are very reactive or very clingy, or it's like protesting significantly that I don't want to be left alone. Okay. Those children may have an anxious, we call it separation anxiety, but they have an anxious attachment. It's like, I need you and I want to be close to you. Other children may be much more secure and they're ready to run off and play with their friends, and they have a great deal of confidence that you're gonna be back to pick them up, and they play. And when you come back, they go home with you, and so that's where the theory really began to gather some steam, is understanding. Okay, how do we make sense of this?
With that? Why are some kids like so easy to run off and go play, and why are other kids like don't go? I'm gonna cling to you. Right,
and so as adults, we think in terms of 4 primary forms of attachment. So you can think of like a window grid of 4 panes. The one is what we call secure attachment, and you can think of the other 3 as insecure attachment. So there's 2 broad categories, secure and insecure. But then the insecure category, you can think of it as being either preoccupied, fearful, and dismissing, or avoidant. And those are 3 distinct ways in which people can be really insecure in their primary relationships.
And we'll attach this graphic in the show notes
Absolutely.
So you can see it. Secure being, that's obviously like the ideal one you want to be in, right?
Correct. I think it's ideal. I would say it's a place where it's healthy.
Okay.
And we can have attachment styles that are not those, because it's kind of like once we have one, we don't really change. It's a little bit like personality. It's pretty stable across time. We can grow in our behavior, so we can act in a place of security. It's almost like we act our way into it. It's like, rather than like, if I tend to be really avoidant, I can learn and discipline myself not to be avoidant, not to withdraw, not to stonewall, not to emotionally distance, not to emotionally shut off, even though that may always be my predisposition or my sense of, this is like, I don't really trust people. I don't know that I can trust other people. DIY guy. It's like, or DIY, do it yourself. It's like, I'll take care of it myself. I trust me. And so maybe that's a good place to start in terms of describing the three categories of insecure.
Okay.
So avoidant people tend to be really dismissing of others. So it's a sense that I have a really high view of myself. I have a great deal of confidence in me. And I'm not talking about narcissism. That's a whole different kind of conversation. Albeit narcissist could be avoidant, but this isn't so much about narcissism, but much about a sense of confidence of like, if I retreat into myself, if I avoid being vulnerable with other people, it's going to go better for me. And so the way I'm going to solve my problems is to withdraw. Okay. So if you think of a husband or a wife in a marriage, if one of them is avoidant, they're going to tend to stonewall or be emotionally distant, emotionally unavailable, particularly in times of distress. There's going to be a sense, if we're frustrated with each other, or if life is throwing me curveballs at work and I'm not doing well, I'm not feeling well, I'm discouraged, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm not sure how things are going to play out, rather than come home and say to my wife, man, I'm really stressed out, I'm really scared, I'm really anxious about this, I might lose this contract at work, this isn't going well. That person probably is not going to be seeking support from their spouse. Rather, they may go out in the garage, drink a beer, go for a run, take care of their emotional needs outside of their primary relationship until they resolve it. And then once they resolve that thing, they may come back to the relationship. But they're likely not going to be vulnerable with another person, because in distress, they'll retreat into themselves. Does that make sense?
That does make a lot of sense. And that's where it's like, it immediately becomes one of those things where it's like, okay, that's not necessarily bad, but it's like important to be able to recognize, if for that married man, if you want to foster more connectivity with your wife, you're going to have to be aware of that. Your default mode is going to be to retreat, and then make intentional decisions to like be vulnerable with your wife or tell her about your day or something like that, you know. But it also, on kind of like the flip side of that, it's like, I can also see where it's like, sometimes maybe the best thing for that man is to just do that thing by himself, so that so that's a helpful one for me to hear, and already to be thinking through that this isn't in and of itself like good, bad. Your framework was like healthy. Like,
I was gonna say, I think good, bad is too dichotomous. Totally. It's not a helpful way of, I don't think it's a helpful way of thinking about it. It's a little bit like personality. It's like, is there a good or bad personality? Well, take personality factors and press them to an extreme. Almost every personality factor can have its pretty dark shadow side. Sure. That's really unhealthy, and it's not good. But that's not true of all personality as a whole. It's not like there's one personality that's a bad personality factor. And so avoidance is a bit that way. So you can think about it in terms of maybe more than just as a category. You can think of it as a spectrum. Like to what degree am I going to be avoidant? And if I am avoidant to an extreme degree, that's probably pathological, or that's probably very unhealthy or sick. And so if I am completely unwilling to associate with people, if anytime I'm distressed, I just cut people out of my life, or if I have a relationship with a person and I get frustrated with you, and it's like, well, you can't be my friend anymore, and I'm just going to avoid friendship. Okay, now we're talking about something that's probably clinically bad or clinically unhealthy. It's like, okay, let's
Yeah, that makes sense.
Let's deal with it. But so we think about it. If we want to think about it most nuanced, we think about it on a spectrum,
Okay.
and by degree rather than good or bad, or you either have it or you don't have it. It's like, no, if I have an avoidant personality style, or not personality per se, I'll keep using personality as kind of almost a metaphor of attachment style, but they have some,
that is a helpful way for me.
They have some similarities,
like,
but they're not.
Everyone has a default personality, like with strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
And you can work on some things, but at the end of the day, it's like it's not really changeable. That is a helpful way of understanding that.
Right. It's just, I think what I don't want our listeners to be confused about is that almost any personality style or any personality could be any of these four. Like you could have,
sure.
You could have extroverted people being avoidant. You could have extroverted people being preoccupied, extroverted people being secure. Like that's like all of these styles can apply to any personality factor.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. 'Cause I was going to make a joke for the next one. The fearful one doesn't mean all introverts are sitting there. There's just as many extroverts as introverts.
Right. And I never looked at the research as terms of like with different personality tests and how they.
Oh, that would be interesting.
That would be interesting. Maybe there's some literature out there. I've never looked up that literature, but that would be fascinating. And so that's the avoidant person. And if you're married to an avoidant person, you realize how painful it can be if a person is just avoidant. And so within relationship, we want to be conversant with and understand the attachment styles of our spouse or the people in our lives, because that can help us understand that default aspect. So if the husband comes home and he's avoidant, he's distressed and he's withdrawing and he's moving towards himself, if the spouse understands that, they can say, oh, this isn't about me. This isn't something wrong with me. Now I can create the environment for that person of safety and security and welcome vulnerability and be with that person.
Yeah, that's good.
In a useful way, in a healing way, in a way that pulls people to realize, if I understand it about myself, I can do the same. I can be like, you know what? My wife needs me to connect with her, not to be withdrawn. I'm distressed at work. I'm upset. I'm frustrated. I'm mad. But I need to relate to her. And if I'm going to create the environment for my wife so that she can thrive, then I'm going to challenge my tendency to avoid and press myself towards the relationship. And we want to take that attitude towards all of these styles. It's like, I want to create the environment for my spouse or for the other person in my life where they can thrive. And so that means I have to understand myself and at times challenge myself in the areas that need to be challenged. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
So let's move. You mentioned fearful. So let's talk a bit about that one.
Okay. And just to recap, because then the different ones will make sense in relation to each other. The avoidant person, the avoidant, what are we calling them?
I'd say avoidant person.
Okay.
Is fine.
Has a higher view of self and a low view of others.
Lower view of others, right.
And so then this fearful one is the lower view of self and lower view of others.
Correct. And so this person can also tend to be avoidant. They can also tend to withdraw from people because of their fear or their anxiety about the relationship. So it's like, I don't really trust other people and I don't really have a great deal of confidence in myself. So I really feel unnerved and I'm feeling pretty terrified.
Yeah.
And so depending on where I'm at on the spectrum, I might actually reach out to other people because I desperately need it and I'm too afraid. So I reach out, or I may retreat further into myself, but that's also unnerving. And so it's a really, really scary kind of place. So I like to think of the fearful person in this category is the person really wants to be able to be with other people. They just don't trust them.
Okay.
But they would like to be able to. The avoidant person, not so much. They're not feeling that much at all. So both, you might see two people both avoiding. One would love to be able to reach out to other people and wishes that they could trust others. The avoidant person probably doesn't even have much of a desire for it. And so the fearful person can tend to be pretty neurotic, meaning driven by very strong emotion. So when the term neurotic clinically is talking about how we experience negative emotion, or like we experience our emotions with a great deal of strength. And so a fearful person can feel a great deal of tension when they're distressed, because they don't know what to do. They don't have a place to turn, and that can be a really difficult and painful place to be.
Yeah, that seems like the most chaotic of them, in the sense that it's like, where do you go if you don't trust yourself or other people? Right.
I mean, that can take you into some pretty dark places.
Yeah.
I mean, it can take you into substances. It can take you into behaviors. It can take you into shallow relationships. And so shallow relationships where it's like, I'm not going to give you too much of me, but I can give you a little bit, but I'm going to always maintain an escape hatch, because you really can't be trusted. And so that anxious, fearful person in relationship may be given to some significant kinds of acting out. So when I think about it from like a sexual addiction standpoint, you may see people who are in this space have a tendency towards acting out with other people sexually in really shallow relationships, because it's like you can get needs met without risk.
Yeah. Okay.
It's like,
it's the, like, I want to be close, but I don't actually trust people to be close.
Right.
So this is that shallow substitute.
Correct.
That makes sense.
Right.
No, that's, wow. Okay. So what's like, if someone finds themselves in this spot, what's the, I don't know, I guess the way forward for them in that? This was one. The last one didn't feel, like, okay, yeah. This one feels like, whoa, that's heavy. That one's really heavy. Right. But I don't know. What would you encourage for someone? Do we want to come back to that question of like moving towards like a healthy, secure personality, or do we want to tackle that now?
That's a good question. We didn't talk about that ahead of time.
Yeah.
So
how about we keep going? How about we go to the last attachment, and then from there,
and then kind of circle back.
Yeah,
sure.
Let's do that.
So let me say just reinforce something here about this theory. This category, the fearful category, this person has a significant distrust of self and a significant distrust of other people, or a low view of self and a low view of others. And so that person does have a unique. They don't have an anchor point to which they can start to feel grounded. So the avoidant person has an anchor point in themselves. The preoccupied person, this is the third category, the third insecure category. The preoccupied person has an anchor point in other people, but they have a low view of self. So the preoccupied person has a high view of others and a low view of self, which means I'm desperate to have you. Like, I need you. I need to be in relationship with you. And so this is where you can see almost like an obsessiveness about a relationship, a place where I am zeroed in. You are my savior. You are my everything. You are the one that can hold me up. If I didn't have you, what would I do? Like you can't abandon me. You can't leave me alone. I'm not okay by myself.
Sure.
And so I'm desperate to keep the relationship. And so that preoccupation can be very smothering for another person, particularly, again, it depends on the spectrum and how much of it, but a person who's really far into the preoccupied space, that person can be very, very difficult, because there's going to be like, you can't ever have any space, or it's like, why don't you love me? Like, do you not, it's this sense that I always need reassurance. You always have to be reassuring me. And it's almost like in the reassurance, it's like, if you keep asking me, do you love me? Well, you're actually increasing the risk. I'm going to get tired of you. Like I can't bear up under that. That's a heavy load to carry, to have to always be holding somebody up. And so preoccupied space, can also be a very, very painful place relationally, because if a person can move from one enmeshed and intense relationship to another. And so it's almost like, if I lose this relationship, I'm going to quickly form another one, and it's going to be really deep, really fast. And so I can bounce through relationships, and relationships can come. They may last a long time. If they don't, I'll probably be in another one pretty quickly, because I'm not okay by myself. And so my preoccupation then is, I got to be in relationship because I desperately need you. And that can be a really painful space in marriage as well. It's like if a person is really high in the preoccupied space, a spouse can get can feel very overbearing, and that can really hurt the relationship.
Okay, great. That one makes a lot of sense as well. What? Yeah, that one makes a lot of sense. So I'm not sure if we really said this at the beginning or not, but like, how are these formed? Like, how does one kind of come to find themselves in one of these quadrants, in more or less dispositionally?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it really forms in childhood. So it's back to kind of the way in which we attach to a primary caregiver. And so there are likely biological, genetic components to this model. There's also parenting styles that can be a part of this style. So we know that children develop these styles very young, and so there seems to be some predisposition that likely comes from some genetic heredity processes. And then parenting styles. Inconsistent parenting can create a great deal of anxiety and fearfulness. So if there's a sense in which I'm trustworthy, but actually no, I'm not. Oh yeah, I am, but no, I'm not. And there's a lot of inconsistency that can really lead a person into kind of one of the insecure kind of categories. And so if a parent, it's like, I really love you, but then I beat you and I'm abusive to you. Well, yeah, that's going to, so severe forms of parenting can really push people. And that's where I think personality likely plays a big role in like which way you might tend to go. It's like, if you're extroverted, will you likely become avoidant? I probably not as quickly, because you're gonna want to be with people. Although I think people can become avoidant and be extroverts. It's like, I might still like to be around a lot of people, but I'm not gonna give myself to you deeply. In that more shallow sense. It's just gonna be in a very shallow sense. So I think abuse, trauma, are all help form the way in which we form these. I think the quality of the relationships, the parental relationships, so the children are always watching their parents and the way parents relate. And so I think it brings a somberness to the importance of marriage and the importance of the quality of relationship we have with our spouse. And it's a little frightening, because like it's, parents have responsibility, and it's not that the way we relate to one another it doesn't impact our children. We often put a lot of emphasis as parents on, we want to really parent well. And sometimes one of the best ways of parenting, I'd say probably the primary way of parenting, is by having and fostering quality relationship with our children's other parent. Yeah. It's like that primary relationship is the fertile ground from which our attachment styles grow. And so if you have parents that are constantly bickering and fighting and not resolving conflict, well, what are children watching? And they're watching it every day, 24/7, from their earliest, from the day they're first taking in sensory information and as an infant through their childhood into adolescence. They're watching their parents every single day, every single interaction, every single mealtime, and so again, it's not that parents have to be so concerned about specific mistakes they make.
Sure.
It's about what kind of patterns are you setting? Like, what is the patterned behavior? And so many parents get unnerved by, like, oh man, I really screwed up. I just yelled at my wife, or I just said something really mean, and it's like, well, that's not the end of the world. In fact, that actually might not even be that particularly problematic, so long as we repair it. Yeah. And let the children watch it be repaired. And it's like, oh, so I can develop secure relationships and have security in my relationships. And I can have a sense of confidence in self and the sense of confidence in other people because I watched my mom and dad resolve a conflict.
Yeah.
And you know what? They even had conflicts often, but they always came back and they resolved it well together. They came back and they apologized to us. I saw them actively working to grow their marriage and to make it work well.
Yeah.
And I have confidence in that. And so what we want to look at is what are the patterns and how we're dealing within a relationship. Now, if we're honest, oftentimes the patterns are pretty sick and are very painful. And I do a lot of marital work. And so I watch and I've observed and I've listened to the stories of people where the patterns are really, really painful and really, really hard and really difficult for children to live under. I listen to the stories of kids who have been traumatized and people who have been through all sorts of hell on earth. And it's like, okay, the environment in which we grow up forms us in really, really significant ways, and it lays the groundwork for our attachment style. And our attachments, the way we attach, can give us a great deal of insight into what we need to do to relate well. It can give us what I would say, like specified, like tailor-made interventions or ways in which we personally need to grow that may not apply to other people in the same way it applies to us. And so when I look back and I think about my family system and the ways in which my immediate family and my extended family dealt with emotion, and I began to hear and experience this sense that emotions are dangerous, very dangerous. Or if you're going to have an intense emotional response to people, you probably should put space between that relationship and you because you don't want to do something wrong. And so intensity. And so you learn these patterns of living from your childhood, from that ground out of which we're growing. And so when we understand that about ourselves, then we can begin to look and say, oh, my tendency is going to be emotional avoidance because that's the ethos. That's the ground I grew up in. And so it's not going to be a surprise that my default is going to be, how about we not do emotion? How about we not go there? How about we not talk about that? How about we not experience the feeling? How about we not express what it felt like? But if I want to be healthy, I don't have to become secure in the sense that that becomes my default. It's that I act in ways that lead me towards security. It leads me towards healthy relationships. So I now know my default is going to be to emotionally withdraw or to not express emotion. Now I know something about myself that I can move towards. Yeah. And so rather than avoiding hard conversations, I can invite them and I can say, we need to talk this out.
That's good. I like the way you said it helps you kind of create like tailor-made interventions to relate more healthily to others. And so thinking about this for, us and ourselves, if I was to create my own intervention plan of how do I, relate to others healthily, what would you recommend or say would be like the steps I should work through to kind of almost create this intervention plan? Does that make sense? Like what are kind of the steps I should walk through, think through, to be able to kind of finally walk away with something that's like, hey, this is my plan. I know this is my default, and I know this is going to be my plan now.
Mm-hmm. One, I think learning about attachment styles, doing some reading, and there's even some assessments. One's called the Experiences in Close Relationship Assessment, and we can try to find a link for that in the show notes if people want to take an instrument that would say, hey, this is a good way of understanding your attachment style. Coming to understand what your attachment style is can be very helpful. And recognizing it, then having conversation, like whether it's in a small group at church or whether it's just with you and your spouse, but opening up conversation about it and about how it has expressed itself in your life, and what are the unique ways that, for good or for bad, this is impacting my life. You can look at times of distress. What do I do, and how's that working for me? Does this help explain some of the difficulties that I face? Does it help clarify the way I could move through the challenges I face? Does it give insight to me or my wife about our marital conflicts that would help me, that would help us understand when we're fighting or when we're in a tough spot? This would help me understand you better. Because I like to think about marriage, like healthy, God-honoring marriage is where we're seeking and striving to create the environment where the other person can thrive. And if I want to create that for my spouse, well, where am I likely going to fall short now? What's going to be hard for me in doing that? Well, my attachment styles, if I am in one of those 3 insecure spaces, that's going to make it hard for my spouse. I'm going to have to be aware of that and actively address it so that I can help my spouse thrive. So as I help myself, I'm helping others. It's a bit like putting on our oxygen mask first on the airplane. It's like, I want to understand myself so that I can be an effective person relationally with the people who are close to me. And that if you're a CEO of a company, knowing the way your default is going to likely give you insight about how you relate to your key staff. It's going to help you know how to relate and what to be aware of. And I think that's unique for each person. So I think starting by learn to know which style do you tend to default to.
Great.
Then I think it's about saying, okay, what are the ways in which this might be a question then for a spouse or for someone close to us. Tell me how do you experience me? What's it like being married to me? Like that's probably not easy. Like that probably has its unique challenges. And so we can gain a lot of, if we're doing this in kind and generous space where our spouse is confident that they can give us feedback that isn't going to bite back at them or become a defensive, but we're genuinely wanting to know so that we can grow, there's a good chance our spouse would be willing to tell us and say, yeah, that when you're really angry or you're really distressed or when you're really anxious and overwhelmed, this is kind of the way you tend to go. And that's hard for me. Well, now we can begin to explore what would be more relationally satisfying. And as we learn that in our marriage, that will extend into other areas of life as well.
That's great. That's good. I'm sure even just the starting to have conversations, with a spouse or whomever, like that's going to inevitably I feel like naturally come up with like, honestly, maybe like even a list of things where it's like, here's the things that I do that matches this thing. And I feel like even once you have that list, you're going to very quickly be able to identify what on that is tweakable. Mm-hmm. Where it's like, rather than going to the garage to drink a beer, I can go actually like have a conversation with my wife and say what's going on, something like that. That I feel like your intervention plan will just kind of become very self-evident after that point.
Right. I think that's that tailor-made aspect. Is it gives us insight about how might I grow as a person. How do I become the kind of man that I want to be in my marriage? How do I become the kind of man that I have? How I want to approach parenting? What kind of dad do I want to be? What kind of person do I want to be? And this theory or this model can begin to open up areas for us to grow and ways for us to understand ourselves, so that we can thrive.
Yeah.
And I think that may be one of the next steps is perhaps it's the aspect of writing or journaling or even just reflecting of just like, okay, I want to think through my story of across time, how has this style served me? Can I see ways in which I've been avoidant across the timeline? And what would have it been like for me had I responded differently with, like, what would have been ways that would have helped me? And as I begin to look at the patterns across life, I can begin to start thinking in terms of, while I can't change the past, I can leverage the past for my future. I can leverage the past to give me insight. I can look at the patterns of the past and say, here are patterns across time that if I change that pattern today, if I think about whatever time I have left on this earth, if I address that pattern today, moving forward, it will accrue to me. It'll be like a good investment.
Yeah.
It will begin to pay dividends across time if I really address that particular pattern in my life. And that can help us tremendously as we are ambitious to grow and learn and become the kind of men that God created us to be.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, because that's and I think our plan is to save this for another conversation. But when I think about this, and especially all of this is kind of formed in childhood, and how you attach to your primary caregivers, where kind of that gets formed. My head is just like spinning with who am I and what am I as a father to my boys right now, and what is that cultivating and creating. And so I think we're going to save another conversation for talking specifically about that as parents and creating, how do we create secure, healthy children? Right. But I think in what you were just talking about too, you can't change the past. And like sometimes I feel like conversations like this, I'm fearful that people will hear this, and especially if you've already gone through parenting and you have grown kids, this feels like potentially a space to just create all sorts of like shame for a parent to be like, well, here's the fruit of your failure, sure. If that makes sense. What would you say to, I don't know, someone listening who maybe feels some of that right now?
Right. I think perhaps one of the deepest mistakes that we can make is to think that we are more disproportionately responsible for the outcomes of our children than we actually are. So there are a lot of variables in our children's lives that have nothing to do with us. And so don't give yourself too much credit, both for the good or for the bad. I look at my kids and I think, oh man, I'm really proud of them. And man, they're doing X and they're really thriving. They're doing great, man. What a great dad I am. Oh man, they're really struggling, man. What a pathetic dad I am. It's like, no, that's too self-absorbed or too focused on me. It's like my kids are succeeding and rising and falling on many, many factors besides just how I parented. So I think that's one thing I would say is like don't take disproportionate amount of credit or guilt related to how children develop. I think the other is to be willing to say, what do we want from people who made mistakes in life? Like what if a parent was abusive? And a parent really did mess up, and really did hurt their children in significant ways. Is there a redemptive pathway?
Yeah.
And is there a redemptive pathway for us when we blow it, when we don't do well? And there is. Like, we're not, and so I think we can just be honest and say, okay, I know I've made mistakes. I made mistakes as a parent. There are things that I didn't do well, and we can have compassion for ourselves in the struggles that we faced, and we can just own it and say, okay, that's the struggle. Where do I go from here? What does it look like for me to address those patterns? Can I begin to foster healthy relationships with my adult children? Can I begin to make right that which wasn't healthy? And I think we live in an age that doesn't want anybody to ever feel bad. Sure. And it's like, well, we do screw up, and we do mess up, and we do hurt people. And I have the capacity to hurt people. And if I'm not willing to address that and take responsibility for it and make it right, well, then I'll probably perpetuate it even further. And so that's a hard space. And the challenge is to move like, and we've had some conversations previously about dealing with shame. Mm-hmm. I think there's this element about, rather than focusing on our shame, we focus on working our way towards dealing with our shame. Like, if we did something wrong, we take ownership for it. We begin to make it right. And we accept the grace and the forgiveness of God. We move forward. And I think that I don't know. I think that's enough. It's like, that is a gift and a grace of God that we can blow it. But many parents are just disproportionately take more responsibility than they need to. And again, you want to think in terms of patterns. If you have had negative patterns, take responsibility for them and talk with your adult children about them, and begin the process of making those right. If you were abusive to your children, I think, like, follow the counsel. This is one of those places I would say, talk with a professional. Like, depending on the severity of abuse, then going back to make something right may actually do further harm. So you have to be really careful in that kind of space. But as a general rule, go make it right. Yeah. Take responsibility and take ownership. Apologize. Say, you know what, and the way I was wired, the way I was thinking, the way I dealt with issues when you were little, man, that was just way too harsh. Like, that was not good for you. And it was not good of me to be there. And I know that hurt you, and I'm sorry. And you know what? I would love from this day forward to build a different kind of relationship with you. Still very imperfect, but I would love the opportunity to rebuild and we make it right. And we build that relationship. And most people are gracious and forgiving.
I can't help but feel of how many families and relationships would be healed if that was just said.
And how many adults who have a broken relationship with a primary person in their life, a mom or a dad, where if the mom or dad came and said that to them, that they wouldn't just be thrilled say, that means so much to me. How many kids go visit the graves of their parents and weep because they would have longed to hear that kind of responsibility taken, and saying, man, Dad, that's what I needed to hear from you. Mom, that's what I needed to hear from you. How many letters have people written to their deceased parent lamenting what they would have loved to hear that they've never heard? And taking responsibility for the way we hurt somebody or the way we dealt with them moves mountains. And I mean, it's redemptive, and there's a lot of grace in that space. And so if you're in that demographic and you're listening, reach out to the people you love and take responsibility and take ownership and make it right, and open up conversation. And of course you can't change the past. Everybody knows that. It's like there's not an expectation that adult children are going to have, that their parents should be able to undo what they've done or how they've been hurt as children. That we know that is what it is. But there is a redemptive pathway, and there is a way to heal those deep hurts.
Dang, that's good.
But that might be a good
good.
stopping point for today.
I think so.
It's somber,
Yeah,
but I think it's hopeful. I think there's a beauty in that kind of redemptive story. How many, like if you watched a good movie and that was the ending right before someone died and they made it right with their children after a horrific story, we would walk out of the theater perhaps in tears, perhaps somber, and be like, wow, that got me. I needed that. And so let's live it. All right. If you're listening, feel free to reach out to us. Our email is in the show notes, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have any ideas of topics you would love to hear us discuss, we would be open to that as well. But thanks for dialing in. Feel free to share with your friends, subscribe, share it with the people in your network of acquaintances.
Good stuff, Tim.
All right. Thanks, Sam.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer. If you're finding this podcast beneficial, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Also, make sure to check out the show notes where you can find links to resources as well as an email address. We want to hear from you. Send us your questions, feedback, and topic ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening.